Hi, everyone. So in the last module, we were talking about CSS grids, right? And we discussed how it's a bit like working with, say, like a Google, Excel, Microsoft Excel spreadsheet, or working with like a Google sheet like I was using here, where we can kind of divide our layout into rows and columns. And then we can kind of position things by moving columns around or by changing the height of things to kind of, position them where we like. We're going to learn another method for doing layout. It's called CSS Flexbox. Okay, this is actually this concept of a Flexbox has been evolving for about 5 years now. I first remember hearing about this about 5 years ago, and it's grown a lot since then. And I want to kind of talk about it. So Flexbox is short for flexible box. Okay. So what do I mean by that? Well, I'm just going to use this program here, and let's pretend this white box is my web page, right? What if I wanted to place this in the direct center? Well, maybe I can align this, and I can align it to the vertical center and then the horizontal center, right? And then let's just say, for the sake of argument, maybe I'm going to add a bunch of items here. And I kind of want them to automatically kind of distribute themselves. So let's, for instance, say I had, let's just say, for the sake of argument, I have 4 columns here. I'm going to highlight these columns and evenly distribute them. That's something I can do. Okay. So that's kind of what we're going to be doing. We are going to be creating a flexible box where it doesn't technically matter how big or small the box is. I can, even if I resize the box bigger or smaller, what'll happen is your content will move around or be flexible to adjust itself to the new content, kind of like what I'm doing here, where I'm readjusting my content, right? Okay. So let's try this out. Okay. I'm going to load in the files for today. So it should be CSS Flexbox or CSS Layout Flexbox. Okay. All right. So we're going to start with something super basic just to kind of, take a look at this. And what I have here is I have a div or a parent container, and I have these sections inside of the div. Okay. Each one is just has some content inside. In this case, it's some basic text, item 1, item 2, item 3, item 4, item 5, right? So the div has a border, a red border around it. So this whole thing should have a red border. And then each section has a blue border around it. Okay, let's take a look at it. So this is what I get. Okay, here's my div with a red border around it. And these are the 5 sections. Now, section tags are blocks. So defaultly, they take up, the whole width of the page because they take up defaultly the width of their parent, so on and so on. And they distributed, vertically, right? What I'm going to do is I'm going to turn this container into a flex box. Okay. So it's very simple. What you do is whatever HTML tag is the parent, you can take the parent, we've talked about display inline, display block, display inline block. We've talked about display grid. Well, now we can do a display flex. Okay. By setting this to display flex, I have now made this a flex box. Okay. What happens is by doing that, the div is the Flexbox. And then each of my items inside the direct children, they become a flex item. Okay. So let's see what happens when that happens. So I'm just going to save. So just by doing this, let's watch what happens. Oops, except I got to save. Now let's do it. Boom. All right. So what happens is that these are now flex items. They're not a and so first of all, they're displaying in one line. Notice that before they were displaying vertically, now they're displaying in one line. All of the items are pretty much at the beginning over here on the left. And my items went from being a block or taking up all of the space. Now they're basically as long as the content. So if I took content and made it longer, you know, this will adjust itself. Okay. Now, these are no longer, you know, before we had we had inline elements, we had block elements. These are no longer inline or block. These are now considered flex items. Okay. And flex items have their own properties that are different than an inline or a block. Okay. All right. So you might look at this and go, you know, man, these containers here, they're really close to each other. Well, we can fix that with something called a flex gap. Okay. It's exercise 2. Let me just preview it real quick. This is what it looks like. Okay. So I have a purple box, and I have these blue items inside of it. Okay. And what I'm going to do is let's turn this into a flex box like I did in exercise 1. So display flex. That's going to turn these from a regular container into a flex container. And that means anything inside of this flex container, all of these now become, because they're direct children, become flex items. All right. So it's doing like it did before. They go from being a block to now displaying in a line. Even though they display in a line, they're not inline items. Okay. They're a separate entity to itself. If I want to separate them, I can. What I can do is say gap. Gap is basically means flex gap. And I'm just going to give it a number like, I don't know, 20 pixels. Okay. When I do that, now there's a space of 20 pixels between each one. All right, so at the moment, this kind of just seems like, you know, okay, great. How is this any different than the inline? Well, let's show you how, you know, this can work and how it can actually be flexible. Let's go to exercise 3. Okay, it's similar setup. There's a div with a bunch of sections. I'm pretty lazy, so I just kept doing the same. You know, this is nice and simple, so hopefully this makes sense. So there's a box. These are my individual items, okay? I'm going to come in here. Let's make this display flex. Okay. And just for fun, let's put a little gap on this so they separate each other. Okay. Boom, 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 boom. Okay. Now, at the moment, you'll notice I have all this extra space here, right? And that space, it depends on whether it's, you know, bigger or smaller, how much space I have here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to come to the item itself. In this case, the section tag is the flex item. And what we're going to use is something called flex grow. Okay. What flex grow does is it essentially, it allows it to take the available space and divide it among however many items are in the list. Okay. Now, the way you do this is you say flex grow 1. 1 is not a value. Essentially, the way this works is that there's 0 and 1. 1 means 0 means like off. It won't grow. 1 means it'll grow. Okay. So by default, flex grow is off, or it's set to 0. We're now sort of quote unquote turning this on. So what that means is See how I've done this now? All of my items are getting additional space. They're basically utilizing that space. And so it doesn't matter. You can see how this is flexible right now. When I move this page bigger or smaller, it's just taking whatever available spaces there is and dividing it between the number of items. Okay. So what's interesting about this is it doesn't matter how many items there are. It'll just keep, readjusting for you. So for instance, if I came in here and I added 2 more sections, and I save and let's refresh. See how it redid this for me? So it automatically set everything. That's really nice. I don't have to sit around and like figure out margins and, how much, space on one side or whatever. I can just kind of quickly add as many items and they'll just automatically be thrown in there. Okay. If you don't want that, for some reason, you can just set it to 0 and then it goes back to whatever the default is. Flex grow 0 is kind of like as if you didn't apply this at all, essentially. But all right, let's do flex shrink. Okay. Once again, I have this div and each of my inside the div is a bunch of children. Okay, let's just take a look at this first. All right. And what I'm going to do is let's set this to Flexbox. So let's do a display flex. Okay. One thing to note is that, each of my columns here is a different width because it's based on the amount of content you have. Sometimes, some columns don't have a lot of content, some have more. Okay. What I'm going to do is I'm now going to set this to a width. So right now this is like, going the width of the page, my div. Okay, the parent div, right? It's just as wide as the parent. And you'll notice when this gets smaller that these kind of adjust themselves to adjust to the new space because they're flexible. They are flexible items or a flex item. Okay. Now, what I could do is I could say, I don't want these items to shrink. Okay. So what I'm going to do is once again, I'm going to give this a width so it's easier to see. I'm just going to give this a width of 800 pixels. Once again, all of the items inside are readjusting themselves in proportion to take up whatever the new width is, which right now, this whole thing from here to here is 800. If I didn't want these elements to adjust themselves, what I could do is I could say flex shrink. Now, normally shrink is on by default, which means it automatically will readjust itself smaller if there's not enough space. If I set this to flex shrink 0, that means these items won't do that. And now they literally break out. See how they're bigger than the item that they're actually inside of? Okay. Now, normally this is on by default, so you don't have to do this, but you can kind of see that we can shrink or not shrink things. Okay. All right. Another thing I kind of want to show here. I have a div here, and once again, it has a bunch of sections in it. Okay. Let's preview this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this to be a Flexbox. Okay, and that's going to put all the items here. Now, as this gets smaller, these items get smaller as well to readjust to the new space. Okay, in this case, the space is the space of the page. So, when these items here, when they're, let me put a little gap on them too, just to make it a little easier to see. There you go. Now, when this is a really wide page, it's easy to sort of, having 5 items looks pretty good, right? And even if I added more items later, it would still look fine. Now, as I make this smaller and smaller, eventually it's getting harder to read this content, right? Now, in this case, there's not a lot of text, but imagine it was like imagine it was a whole like column or something. This would be difficult. So what would actually be better from a design standpoint is what if I could make these items moved down to the next part of the page? If you think about it, this is kind of how most other design programs work, right? So if you're in, say, I'm just going to use Adobe Illustrator. Actually, why not? I'll throw in this into Figma. So normally what would happen is when you resize something like this, when there's not enough space, the content, moves to the next line, right? This is typically how most text documents work. This is called text wrapping. Well, what if I could get the items here to wrap or move down? So what I'm going to do I'm going to take this and I'm going to say, we're going to use something called flex wrap. Now, defaultly, it does not, this value is set to not to wrap, okay? Meaning things do not wrap as they get smaller, they just start to shrink, okay? Instead of having it shrink, I want it to wrap, so let's set it to wrap, okay? Oops, except I don't want this text, sorry about that. Now let's try this out. So, when it's bigger, it all stays in one line. As this gets smaller, you can see that the items start to move down to other lines, okay? So that becomes a little bit easier to read, okay? So it's kind of up to you. You can decide whether you want everything to remain in one line or whether you want it to break lines. Let's see how this could play out. Just to give you an idea, I have this div here, and inside of the div are 3 children. Each is about a different food: pizza, hamburgers, and tacos. Okay. So I'm going to preview this. And I'm actually going to turn this into columns, right? Columns in a design are like, text next to each other. So what I'm going to do is I can say, well, here's the parent. Let's take the parent and say display flex. Okay, let's put a little gap too, just so it's a little bit easier to see each column. So I'll put about 15 pixels between each column. Now you'll notice here that the tacos is way wider than the other two, right? And that's because, it's flexible. When something has more content, like for instance, the taco section has much more content or more text than the other two. So it's given more space. There's I don't want to get into this right now because it's not that important, but there's an actual formula that figures out how much something content it has versus how much space it'll take up. But what if this is kind of nice, but maybe I don't want each column to be a different width. Even if I was to make this wider from like 800 to 1000, it wouldn't change that. It would just grow exponentially for all of them. So in this case, what I want is I want this, this, and this to all be the same width. Well, we could do that. The way we would do that is you take the flex item, and there's something called flex basis. Okay, flex basis, what it is it's basically like the width of something. It's not quite the width, but in this case, it's going to act like the width of a flex item. Okay, so for instance, I'm going to take the flex items here, and I'm going to give it a flex item basis or flex basis of 300. Okay, what this means now is that each of these becomes 300. So if you actually come here, I'm going to do a little inspect, and you can, I can't do it there, but you can see how the width is 300, that one's 300, and that one's 300. Okay. Now that's great and everything, but what if I wanted it to kind of act like a percentage where, you know, rather than having to give it an exact number, maybe I just wanted to take up the available space. So in other words, like if there's 3 items, each would be 33 and a third. If there's 4, they'd be 20%, 25%, I mean. If there's 5, there's 20, and so on and so on. Well, we could do that. What we can do is we're going to set this. By the way, if you wanted to go back to the way it normally, you know, where each column gets its own width, that would be flex basis auto. Okay, that's the default. Typically, if you want each column to be the same width, you could set the flex basis to 100%. And that means it's going to figure out how many items there are and give each one the same width. So now this should still be, let's do, so now this is 23, you know, 323, 323, 323. So in other words, if I made this wider, each should still get the same width. Or if I add another element, let's say I add another section here to make it 4 columns, for instance, you know, it's going to just readjust everything on the fly, and it's like each one gets the same width. Okay, so hopefully you can see how this can be really useful, especially in designs where maybe elements are going to be added or subtracted at any point. Imagine you're like Amazon, right? So at any point with an Amazon design, it's like, you know, Amazon has so many items, right? So at any point, like maybe they're going to take this item out because it's sold out, and, you know, so now instead of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, now there's 5 elements, right? Or maybe they're going to add 2 more, and now there's 7 elements, right? So rather than having to have an exact worrying about the exact size, we could do something where it's just like, you know, it just takes however many items there are and just, you know, figures out space for them. Okay, so that's the first part. So try that out. That's exercise 1 through 6. Okay, we're just go over the basics of how Flexbox works. You know, what is Flexbox? What's a flex item? Using grow, using wrap, and creating columns. In the next one, we're going to definitely play around with aligning content. And then we're going to see how we can use Flexbox to make a pretty relatively interesting layout.